Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Galactic Council chamber, light shimmered from crystalline panels that caught and refracted every flicker of motion. Alien dignitaries lounged in their thrones of carved stone, organic resin, or glimmering alloy, a tapestry of empires so ancient they considered the council's existence itself a monument to permanence. Their voices, modulated through the chamber's translators, overlapped in layers of arrogance, each one dismissing the same subject, the species that had grown too quickly, too boldly, on the fringes of the spiral arm. They multiply like vermin, rasped a saurian delegate whose scaled arms were wrapped in gold. Within 2 centuries, they have claimed more systems than any world within our memory. This cannot be allowed to continue. A being composed of pale tendrils waved lazily, its movements carrying disdain sharper than any words. Humans are fragile. Their lives are brief. Push them, and they will fracture. Sanctions will suffice. Across the chamber, a hulking arthropoid clacked its mandibles. Sanctions? You propose to starve predators? They will bare their teeth. I say seize their colonies now, while they are scattered and weak. The murmur swelled, consensus building, contempt woven into every syllable. Humanity was reduced to a problem on parchment, an unruly subject to be disciplined by decree. For centuries the Council had crushed rebellions with the ease of stamping insects, and this would be no different. Yet one voice in the chamber did not match the chorus. He sat in a seat too small, at a table positioned deliberately lower than the rest, his frame stiff beneath the tailored black of his diplomatic suit. His name was Elias Ward, Earth's sole ambassador allowed within the chamber, and he had been forced to listen to this farce for hours. His face, worn from years of negotiation, was unreadable, but the stillness of his hands betrayed a self-control stretched thin. When the Council's presiding arbiter finally turned its compound eyes toward him, the silence that fell was not out of respect but condescension. You may speak, human. Offer your excuses. Ward rose slowly, his every movement deliberate, his gaze sweeping the semicircle of thrones. Excuses are unnecessary, he said, his voice carrying through the chamber with unnerving clarity. Humanity does not apologize for breathing, for growing, or for striving. We have claimed only what we have built with our own hands. We asked no permission then, and we will not ask it now. A ripple of disdain coursed through the chamber. Some delegates laughed, a chorus of hisses, clicks, and guttural chuckles. Others leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with interest at this display of insolence. You mistake your position, the saurian snapped. You are permitted this chamber by our indulgence. You are tolerated because your kind amuses us. Nothing more. Ward inclined his head slightly, as if conceding the insult. But when he spoke again, his tone had hardened. For centuries, humanity has abided your borders and respected your decrees, even when they served only to chain us. We endured insult, interference, and theft disguised as taxation. We accepted it because we believed coexistence was possible. His voice lowered, and the restraint in it seemed more threatening than any raised shout. But every species has a boundary. You have crossed ours. The chamber rustled, unease flickering behind postures of superiority. The Council had grown accustomed to human ambassadors pleading, bargaining, or swallowing humiliation. They had never heard one issue a warning. The arbiter's mandibles clicked in amusement. A boundary? You presume to draw lines for the Council? We will seize your colonies, strip your fleets, and grind your defiance into the dust of your homeworld. That is the boundary. Ward's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. Then understand this, he said softly, each word carved with deliberate weight. Humanity will not kneel. If you take one more step into our space, you will not find subjects. You will find predators. And we will not stop until the Council itself is ash. For a moment the chamber seemed to shrink around him, the silence hanging heavy. Some delegates scoffed, unwilling to believe the audacity. Others shifted uncomfortably, remembering battles where small human fleets had bled opponents dry before collapsing only when every man had fallen. The arbiter broke the silence with a chittering laugh. Empty threats from a dying breed.
So be it.
Let the vote be recorded. A pulse of light rippled across the chamber, each delegate casting their decision. The outcome was inevitable. Unanimous approval. Sanctions, seizures, subjugation. Humanity was to be broken before it could stand tall enough to threaten the old order. Ward stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on nothing, his face an unyielding mask. Only as the chamber lights dimmed to signal adjournment did he allow himself the faintest exhale. He turned toward the exit, his steps measured, but before he crossed the threshold he paused. Without looking back, he spoke into the silence. You've crossed the boundary. Pray you never see what waits beyond. The doors closed behind him, cutting him off from the laughter that followed. The council believed it had triumphed again, blind to the storm it had just summoned. Humanity had been pushed to the edge, and Elias Ward's words were no longer the language of diplomacy. They were prophecy. News of the council's decrees spread across human space like wildfire. On Earth, screens blazed with breaking reports, voices of outrage rising from crowded cities and rural outposts alike. In the colonies, men and women abandoned half-built homes to stare at the sky, imagining fleets descending to strip their lives bare. The council had not just sanctioned humanity, it had branded every citizen of Earth a trespasser in their own stars. In the subterranean command chamber beneath Geneva, the air was heavy with silence before the storm. At the central table stood Admiral Marcus Hale, a tall figure with iron-gray hair cropped short and eyes that carried the weight of every battle fought and lost in preparation for wars that were never meant to come. His uniform was immaculate, but there was nothing ornamental about the man himself. He had earned command not through politics but through victories carved from desperation. Opposite him leaned General Leon Varga, broader, younger, with scars across his jaw that spoke of close combat. His voice carried the raw edge of impatience. They mean to choke us before we draw another breath. If we wait, they'll take the colonies system by system until Earth itself is surrounded. We cannot afford hesitation. Hale's gaze flicked to the projection above the table, a three-dimensional map of human-controlled space, with council fleets marked in crimson, already massing near frontier systems. Haste without precision is suicide, he said evenly. The council believes us weak, because they see only what we've shown. That arrogance is our only advantage. Varga's fist struck the table, the sound echoing. Then it's time we show them what we've become. You've seen the reports from Vega Station. A dozen of our ships outmaneuvered 50 of theirs. We've built weapons they've never imagined. Around the chamber, lesser officers shifted uneasily, glancing between the two giants of command. Both spoke truth, but their visions of the path forward diverged. Hale's patience was legendary, Varga's aggression equally so. Yet beneath the clash of temperaments was the same unyielding core. Neither would accept submission. The discussion gave way to action. Plans were drawn, resources allocated, and orders relayed. Humanity's war machine, long hidden behind the facade of compliance, rumbled to life. Shipyards orbiting Luna lit up as skeletal frames were armed with plasma lances and stealth drives. In underground vaults, rail cannons the size of skyscrapers were readied for planetary defense. On Mars, conscripts drilled until their voices broke, their chants of defiance rising into the thin air. Hale stood alone later that night, watching the stars from the command chamber's viewing port. The silence pressed heavy against him, a reminder that every decision he made would carve history with blood. He thought of the ambassador, Elias Ward, standing alone before the council. The man's words had been a spark. It was Hale's task now to make sure that spark became a fire too great for the galaxy to extinguish. 3 weeks later, the storm broke. The council's first move was bold. A fleet descended upon Kestrel, a frontier colony barely 2 generations old. Its defenses were minimal, its people unprepared. The council expected surrender, a swift seizure to break morale. What they found instead was resistance. From the dark between stars, a human strike group emerged, 12 ships against nearly 40. They were not the heavy cruisers the council remembered, but lean predators, clad in black alloy that bent light around them. They moved as one, precise and ruthless, their weapons tearing through alien shields with brutal efficiency. Admiral Hale's voice carried across the fleet comms. They came to seize what we built. Make them understand their mistake. The first volley reduced 3 enemy frigates to molten wreckage. Human ships weaved between the larger vessels, cutting engines, pivoting with impossible agility, then striking from blind angles. Where the Council relied on numbers, humanity relied on adaptability. Every maneuver was calculated to exploit arrogance, every shot placed to cripple rather than waste energy. General Varga commanded the ground defense, leading his soldiers in brutal close quarters fighting as Council troops attempted to land. He was everywhere at once, on the barricades shouting orders, dragging wounded men back to cover, hurling grenades into advancing formations. His presence turned raw recruits into fighters who refused to yield. Hours bled into a day. When the smoke cleared, Kestrel still stood. Of the Council's force, barely a third limped back to hyperspace, their commanders stunned by the ferocity of the resistance. The victory sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Rumors spread faster than reports, whispers carried from one world to another. A dozen human ships had annihilated a fleet 4 times its size. Council soldiers spoke in hushed tones of humans who fought like cornered beasts, who did not retreat, who did not surrender, who stared into death without blinking. On Earth, the people erupted. Crowds filled the streets, voices unified in chants that had no need for translation. Never again. Never again. In the council chambers, silence reigned as casualty reports scrolled across towering displays. Delegates who had laughed at Elias Ward's warning now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time in centuries, the council had encountered not a rebellion but an enemy. And enemies did not bow. Admiral Hale received the report from Kestrel in the dim quiet of his quarters. He read it once, then again, his expression unreadable. At last he allowed himself the faintest of smiles, though it carried no joy, only grim recognition. Humanity had drawn blood. The war the Council had invited was no longer a threat, it was reality. And Marcus Hale, with Leon Varga at his side, would see it through to the end. The reports arrived in the Council chamber like shards of glass, sharp enough to cut through even the thickest layers of arrogance. Fleet commanders who had expected triumph now stammered before their superiors, describing human vessels that moved like shadows and soldiers who fought with a brutality that unsettled even hardened veterans. Some delegates scoffed, claiming exaggeration, but others sat silent, remembering the whisper of Elias Ward's warning. Admiral Marcus Hale read those same reports from the war table aboard the Resolute, his flagship. Unlike the Council, he wasted no breath on disbelief. The victory at Kestrel had proven humanity's strength, but Hale understood it was only the beginning. The Council would come harder, faster, and in greater numbers. If humanity wanted to survive, it could not wait to be cornered. It had to strike first. In the dim glow of the tactical display, Hale conferred with General Leon Varga, who had been ferried up from the surface after weeks of relentless ground campaigns. Varga's uniform still bore the stains of battle, a jagged scar freshly sealed across his forearm. He leaned over the table, studying enemy fleet positions with a predator's focus. They'll regroup near the Helios corridor. If we move now, we can cut them off before they stabilize their lines. Hale's voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of command. Then we move, but not with brute force. We bleed them from the edges, supply lines, outposts, command ships. We make every victory cost them tenfold. Let them learn fear one loss at a time. For weeks, humanity's fleets struck deep into Council space. Stealth ships slipped past sensors, hitting fuel convoys and orbital foundries before vanishing. Squadrons of interceptors lured larger cruisers into ambushes, dismantling them piece by piece. Colonists on threatened worlds found themselves defended not by token patrols, but by coordinated, ruthless counterattacks. The Council, for all its centuries of dominance, discovered that its war machine was brittle when forced to adapt. Every battle honed humanity's reputation. Prisoners taken by the Council spoke of interrogations that yielded little, Human soldiers endured pain with silent defiance, refusing to betray their comrades. Alien analysts began whispering a phrase that spread like contagion: "Humans do not fear death." General Varga embraced that truth on the battlefield. He led his men through sieges where ammunition ran dry and every shot was counted, where rations dwindled and exhaustion gnawed at the edges of sanity. Yet his soldiers followed him with unwavering loyalty because Varga was never behind them. He was always in the breach, his rifle spitting fire beside theirs. To the council, it was unthinkable that a commander would fight among the rank and file. To humanity, it was the only way. Meanwhile, Admiral Hale orchestrated his war with surgical precision. He spoke little, but his strategies carved chaos into the heart of council territory. Entire sectors flickered with instability as their supply chains collapsed. Hale's philosophy was simple: strike where the council believed itself untouchable, show them that no fortress, no fleet, no bastion of their ancient order was beyond humanity's reach. The culmination came at Draven's Rift, a system guarded by one of the Council's largest forward fleets. The Council had gathered nearly 100 ships, confident they would crush the human presence that dared approach. What they did not know was that Hale had spent weeks studying their patterns, analyzing their reliance on rigid formations and centralized command. As the battle commenced, human ships appeared not in a single wave but in fragments, scattering the Council's attention. They struck at communication relays, disabled command vessels, and retreated before counterstrikes could land. Confusion spread through the alien ranks, orders contradicting one another, formations unraveling. Then Hale unleashed the core of his fleet, hidden until the moment the enemy was most divided. The rift blazed with fire as human warships carved through the heart of the Council Armada. Explosions painted the void, debris fields stretching across the system like scars. Varga's ground units struck simultaneously on the moon below, seizing critical installations and forcing the surrender of Council officers who had never imagined defeat. In the aftermath, humanity stood victorious, though at terrible cost. Hulls drifted lifeless in the dark, and thousands of men had given their lives. Hale walked the silent corridors of the Resolute, seeing the faces of every crewman who would never return home. Yet his resolve only hardened. Each loss was a reminder of what was at stake: not territory, not resources, but the right to exist unshackled. The victory at Draven's Rift could not be hidden. Word spread across the galaxy, carried by refugees, traitors, even deserters from the Council's ranks. Whispers became proclamations. The Council was bleeding, and humanity was the blade. Species that had long cowered under the Council's heel began to watch Earth with new eyes, not as upstarts, but as champions. Within the Council chamber, divisions deepened. Some delegates demanded a total mobilization, the annihilation of Earth, no matter the cost. Others, wary and shaken, began to suggest negotiations. The unity that had lasted for millennia cracked, the fractures widening with every human victory. Admiral Hale listened to intercepted broadcasts in silence, then turned to Varga. "They're unraveling. Fear is doing our work for us." Varga, seated with his arm in a sling, gave a grim smile. "Good. Let them feel it. Let them know what it means to start a war they can't finish." Hale returned his gaze to the stars beyond the viewport. The war was far from over. The Council still commanded fleets that dwarfed humanity's numbers, and the next battles would demand everything his people could give. Yet he could see it now, the possibility of not just survival but victory. The Council had crossed humanity's boundary, and now they were learning the cost. What remained was to drive the lesson home until no one in the galaxy could forget it. The Council chamber no longer echoed with laughter. Reports of defeat arrived daily, each one heavier than the last, until even the most arrogant delegates began to falter beneath the weight of undeniable truth. The unity that had held the great empires together for ages was fraying, suspicion gnawing at its edges. Some called for negotiation, others demanded escalation, but none could erase the fact that the humans they had sought to crush were now driving the war. On the Resolute, Admiral Marcus Hale stood before the war table, the glow of star charts painting his face in pale light. Entire sectors of council space now flickered with instability. Supply lines collapsed, outposts deserted, and once proud fleets reduced to wreckage. Yet Hale knew the council's strength was not broken, only wounded. A cornered beast was most dangerous in its final moments. General Leon Varga entered the chamber, his presence filling the space with restless energy. His arm was no longer in a sling, though the scars of countless battles remained visible. He leaned over the table, eyes fixed on the cluster of red markers forming near the Eridani expanse. "That's their last card," he said. "Every ship they can still muster. They mean to end this with one decisive strike." Hale's gaze did not waver. "Then we meet them there. Not on their terms, but ours. If we break them in the expanse, the Council will have nothing left to hide behind." The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Shipyards emptied as every vessel capable of bearing arms was pressed into service. Veterans who had already given everything returned to their stations without hesitation. On Earth, Mars, and the far colonies, messages from families flooded the fleets, words of pride, of grief, of determination. Every man understood that what lay ahead was not merely a battle for territory, but the trial that would decide whether humanity stood free or fell into chains forever. The two fleets met in the Eridani expanse, a void of shifting nebulae that cast ghostly light across the battlefield. The Council armada stretched across the stars, a leviathan of power, hundreds of ships bristling with weapons. Humanity's fleet was smaller, leaner, but forged in fire. Every captain, every soldier, every pilot carried the weight of battles survived and comrades buried. Hale stood at the command deck of the Resolute, hands clasped behind his back. "Transmit to all ships," he ordered. His voice remained steady, though it carried the gravity of a man who understood that his words might be the last his people would ever hear. "Today we stand not as subjects, not as prey, but as men. The Council believed they could dictate our existence. Show them they were wrong. Show them what it means to fight humanity." The transmission ended, and the void erupted. The Council charged with overwhelming force, intent on crushing the smaller fleet in a single sweep. Human ships did not retreat. They split, weaving through the gaps with impossible precision, exploiting every weakness, striking at the heart of formations before vanishing into nebula clouds. Rail cannons tore through armored hulls, plasma lances carved scars into the Leviathan. The Council had numbers, but numbers could not replace resolve. General Varga led the assault on the ground installations orbiting a barren moon within the system. He moved with the fury of a storm, his soldiers following through fire and blood. Every barricade taken, every enemy broken, was another piece of the Council's strength dismantled. His men fought not for orders but for survival, for the right to return home, for the promise that their children would never kneel. The battle raged for hours, then days. Losses mounted on both sides, the void littered with burning husks of ships, the moon's surface scarred with craters and ruins. Yet humanity refused to yield. Hale's strategies bent the tide, turning what should have been annihilation into attrition, bleeding the Council's armada dry. At last, the Council's flagship loomed before the Resolute, a monstrous vessel bristling with weaponry. Hale's officers looked to him for command, and he gave none beyond a single, quiet order. "Forward." The Resolute drove into the heart of the enemy, weapons blazing. The two ships exchanged fire at point-blank range, the void erupting with detonations that could have split worlds. When the flagship finally tore apart, flames scattering into the nebula, silence fell across the comms. The Council's fleet, leaderless and broken, began to retreat in fragments, fleeing the battlefield they had sworn to dominate. The war was over. In the aftermath, Hale stood once more before the fleet, his uniform scorched, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. His words were broadcast not only to his men but to every world that had watched humanity's struggle with bated breath. The Council sought to chain us. They sought to dictate our future. But today, we showed them we are not subjects. We are not prey. We are human. And we will never kneel. The galaxy listened. Species long cowed into silence now dared to dream of defiance. The council, once unshakable, was fractured beyond repair, its aura of inevitability shattered. Humanity did not seize their worlds, did not enslave their peoples, but left them with a warning carved in fire. Cross the boundary again, and it will be the last mistake you ever make. On the observation deck of the Resolute, Hale and Vargas stood side by side, gazing into the endless stars. The war had cost them more than they could ever reclaim, but it had also won them something no power could take away. Respect.
Fear.
Freedom. Varga broke the silence with a dry laugh. Think they'll try again? Hale's eyes remained fixed on the stars, his voice quiet but unyielding. If they do, they'll remember what waits beyond. The two men stood there as the fleet drifted in silence, guardians of a new era, the memory of the Council's arrogance still burning in the void behind them. The war was ended, but the story of humanity had only just begun.